The German tank commander, adjusting his periscope on the morning of July 12, 1943, near the village of Prokhorovka, expected to see the kind of target-rich environment that had characterized previous engagements during Operation Citadel. Scattered Soviet armor advancing in disorganized waves that German Tiger tanks could destroy methodically at long range using superior optics and powerful 88mm guns. Yet what appeared through his magnified view was not dozens, but hundreds of T-34 medium tanks charging directly toward German positions in a mass formation that seemed to violate every principle of armored tactics that German doctrine taught. And in the moment before the Soviet tanks closed to point-blank range, where German advantages in gunnery and armor protection would be neutralized by sheer numbers and by the chaos of close-quarters combat, the German commander understood that everything Wehrmacht intelligence had told them about Soviet tank production and tactical competence was catastrophically wrong. The Germans had mocked the T-34 since first encountering it in 1941, calling it a crude tractor built by peasants who understood nothing about precision engineering, dismissing its sloped armor as a gimmick that could not compensate for poor construction quality, and assuming that German superiority in crew training and in technical sophistication would allow Tiger and Panther tanks to dominate any engagement regardless of numerical disadvantages. Yet here at Prokhorovka, those assumptions were being tested against a Soviet tank force that had achieved something the Germans thought impossible: producing armoured vehicles in quantities so vast that individual quality became irrelevant because losing 3 T-34s to destroy 1 Tiger was an acceptable exchange ratio when Soviet factories were building 5 T-34s for every Tiger that German industry could manufacture. They laughed at the T-34's crude construction. These German tank crews and engineering officers who had been trained to appreciate precision machining and tight tolerances, and who viewed the T-34's rough welding and simple design as evidence of Soviet technological backwardness, calling it a Bolshevik tractor, and joking that it was built in tractor factories by workers who had never seen a real tank, comments that reflected genuine contempt for Soviet manufacturing capabilities, but that fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between design sophistication and battlefield effectiveness, because what German critics saw as crude simplicity was actually brilliant design optimization for mass production under wartime conditions where speed of manufacture mattered more than refinement of finish. The specific elements of T-34 design that German engineers mocked, including the Christie suspension that created a rough ride, the lack of a turret basket that made the crew's job more difficult, the simple transmission that required enormous physical strength to operate, and the minimal crew comforts that made operating the tank exhausting, were precisely the design choices that allowed Soviet factories to produce T-34s at rates that German factories could never match, because every simplification reduced manufacturing time and every component that could be produced by semi-skilled workers rather than requiring master craftsmen increased production capacity. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. The Tiger tank that Germany deployed in response to the T-34 represented the opposite design philosophy, emphasizing technical superiority and individual combat effectiveness over production efficiency, with an 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, frontal armor up to 100mm thick that was nearly invulnerable to most anti-tank weapons, and sophisticated optical equipment that allowed accurate fire under conditions where other tanks would be shooting blind, capabilities that made the Tiger the most formidable tank of World War II in terms of pure combat effectiveness, but that came at enormous costs in manufacturing complexity, maintenance requirements, and fuel consumption that limited how many Tigers could be produced and how effectively they could be deployed. The production statistics tell the story of this design trade-off. Germany manufactured approximately 1,050 Tigers between 1942 and 1944, an impressive achievement given the tank's complexity, but a trivial number compared to the 57,000 T-34s that Soviet factories produced during the same period. Numerical disparity that meant that even if Tigers achieved kill ratios of 10 to 1 or even 20 to 1 against T-34s, they would eventually be overwhelmed through simple attrition because Soviet industry could replace losses faster than German industry could produce new Tigers. The tactical doctrine that Soviet forces developed for employing T-34s against heavier German armour evolved through bitter experience during 1941 and 1942, when Soviet tank crews learned that attempting to engage Tigers and Panthers at long range was suicidal because German optics and guns were superior, and that the only way to neutralize German advantages was to close range rapidly and create chaotic engagements where German technical superiority was overwhelmed by Soviet numerical superiority and by the confusion of close quarters combat where a Tiger's long-range accuracy became irrelevant. Tactics that required accepting horrific casualties during the approach, but that could achieve decisive results if Soviet forces committed sufficient numbers to ensure that some T-34s survived to reach close range where they could exploit the Tiger's vulnerabilities, including thinner side and rear armour and the slow turret traverse that made Tigers vulnerable to being flanked by faster Soviet tanks. The famous Soviet tactic of tanko-desantniki, infantry riding on tanks into battle, supported this approach by providing protection against German anti-tank infantry that might otherwise have destroyed T-34s with Panzerfausts or magnetic mines before they could engage German heavy armour, creating combined arms teams that maximised T-34 effectiveness even when operating against technically superior opponents. The specific engagement at Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, that opened this narrative represented the apex of the T-34 mass assault tactic, when the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army committed over 800 tanks, including approximately 500 T-34s, to a frontal assault against German positions that included significant numbers of Tigers and Panthers, attack that Soviet commanders knew would result in catastrophic losses, but that they calculated would destroy enough German armour to halt Operation Zitadelle and create conditions for Soviet counteroffensive. And while exact casualty figures remain disputed with Soviet and German sources providing contradictory accounts, the strategic result was clear. The German offensive was stopped and would never resume, while Soviet forces, despite losing hundreds of tanks, retained sufficient strength to continue operations because their losses could be replaced within weeks, while German losses, though smaller in absolute numbers, represented irreplaceable combat power that could not be regenerated quickly enough to affect the strategic balance. The willingness of Soviet commanders to accept loss rates that would have been considered unacceptable by Western standards reflected different calculations about acceptable casualties and about the relationship between material losses and strategic objectives, because Soviet doctrine emphasized achieving decisive results regardless of costs, while German doctrine increasingly emphasized preservation of scarce resources, even when that meant accepting unfavorable strategic outcomes. The mechanical reliability comparison between T-34 and Tiger revealed another dimension of the design trade-off between sophistication and practicality, because the Tiger's complex transmission and suspension required frequent maintenance by skilled mechanics and had high failure rates under the stress of combat operations, meaning that operational availability of Tiger units was typically much lower than the number of Tigers officially assigned to those units, with significant percentages of Tigers being non-operational at any given time due to mechanical problems or lack of spare parts, while the T-34's simpler mechanical systems, though less refined, were more robust and easier to repair, allowing Soviet tank units to maintain higher operational readiness rates despite having less sophisticated maintenance infrastructure. The specific example of Tiger transmission failures becoming so common that German tank crews developed dark humour about whether they would be destroyed by enemy fire or by their own gearbox illustrated how technical sophistication could become a liability when it created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit simply by forcing German tanks to manoeuvre extensively, because each gear change risked transmission failure, and each kilometre travelled increased the probability of mechanical breakdown that would immobilise the tank regardless of how much armour it had or how powerful its gun was. The fuel consumption rates of German heavy tanks created logistical nightmares that limited their tactical employment, because a Tiger consumed approximately 300 litres of fuel per 100 kilometres under road conditions and even more cross-country, meaning that each Tiger required a constant supply line of fuel trucks that were themselves vulnerable to Soviet attack, and that limited how far from supply depots Tigers could operate effectively, while T34s, though not fuel efficient by absolute standards, consumed roughly half as much fuel per kilometre and could operate further from their supply bases, giving Soviet forces greater operational flexibility and allowing them to conduct deep penetration operations that German heavy armour could not match because they would run out of fuel before reaching their objectives. The strategic implication of this fuel consumption differential was that German heavy tanks were essentially defensive weapons that could dominate local engagements when properly positioned and supplied, but that could not conduct the kind of mobile offensive operations that German doctrine emphasized, creating a mismatch between the capabilities that Tigers provided and the operational requirements that the Eastern Front imposed, while T-34s, despite their individual inferiority to Tigers in direct combat, were better suited to the operational requirements of mobile warfare that characterized much of the Eastern Front fighting. The crew training comparison between German and Soviet tank forces revealed yet another dimension where German advantages in quality were being overcome by Soviet advantages in scale, because German tank crews received extensive training that made them highly skilled at gunnery and tactics, but that took months to complete, and that could not be accelerated without reducing effectiveness, while Soviet training was shorter and less thorough, but produced crews quickly enough to keep pace with production, creating a situation where German crews were individually more skilled, but where Soviet forces could afford to lose crews and replace them, while German forces faced growing shortages of trained personnel as the war progressed and as casualties accumulated faster than training schools could produce replacements. The metallurgical differences between T-34 and Tiger armour revealed another aspect of the quality versus quantity trade-off, because German armour plate was made from high-quality steel alloys with careful heat treatment that maximised hardness while maintaining toughness, producing armour that resisted penetration exceptionally well, but that required sophisticated manufacturing processes and quality control, while Soviet armour plate was made from simpler steel that was easier to produce in quantity, but that was sometimes brittle and prone to shattering when hit, creating situations where T-34 armour might fail catastrophically from hits that German armour would resist. Yet this inferior metallurgy mattered less when Soviet doctrine emphasized avoiding direct engagement with German heavy tanks, and when production capacity allowed replacing destroyed T-34s faster than they could be eliminated. The specific example of Soviet factories deliberately accepting lower quality standards for armour plate in order to increase production rates illustrated the strategic calculation that having 10 mediocre tanks was better than having 3 excellent tanks when the operational requirement was saturating battlefields with armour that German forces could not destroy faster than it could be replaced. The German perspective on fighting T-34s evolved dramatically between 1941, when they first encountered the design, and 1943, when numerical disparity had become overwhelming, with early reports expressing shock at the T-34's sloped armour and 76mm gun that could defeat German tanks at ranges where German return fire was ineffective, followed by a period of technical adaptation when German forces developed tactics and weapons that could defeat T-34s reliably, and finally giving way to resignation and despair as German tank commanders realized that no amount of individual tactical skill could compensate for being outnumbered 5-1 or 10-1 by enemy tanks that were individually inferior but collectively unstoppable. The diary entries and letters from German tank crews during 1943 and 1944 document this psychological progression, with early confidence about German technical superiority giving way to complaints about being overwhelmed by endless hordes of Soviet tanks. Language that echoed racist stereotypes about Asian masses, but that also reflected genuine tactical reality that German forces were being buried under weight of numbers that made individual engagements meaningless because destroying 10 Soviet tanks in one engagement was a tactical success but a strategic failure when 50 more tanks would arrive the next day. The production methodology that allowed Soviet factories to manufacture T-34s at such high rates involved radical simplification of manufacturing processes, including tolerance standards that would have been rejected as unacceptable in German factories, but that proved adequate for producing functional tanks, use of stamping and welding instead of more precise machining wherever possible, substitution of scarce materials with more available alternatives even when this reduced performance slightly, and acceptance of high defect rates with the calculation that even if 20% of tanks had quality problems that required post-production repair, this was preferable to producing 20% fewer tanks with perfect quality control. The specific innovation of using tractor factories to produce tanks meant that Soviet industry could leverage existing industrial capacity and skilled workforce rather than building dedicated tank factories from scratch. Adaptation that allowed rapid scaling of production in ways that German industry, which relied on specialized tank manufacturers, could not match, and this use of civilian industrial infrastructure for military production demonstrated strategic thinking about total mobilization that went beyond simply building more factories to fundamentally reconceptualizing what industrial mobilization meant. The combat account from a Soviet tank commander named Dmitry Loza, whose memoir provides detailed description of fighting Tigers in his American-supplied M4 Sherman tank, but whose observations about T-34 tactics remain valuable, describes an engagement near Minsk in summer 1944 where his unit encountered 3 Tigers defending a crossroads, situation that conventional tactics would have suggested bypassing or waiting for artillery support to eliminate, but where Soviet doctrine called for immediate frontal assault using overwhelming numbers to paralyze German response. And Loza describes watching 12 T-34s charge the German position while his Sherman provided supporting fire, seeing 5 T-34s destroyed in the initial exchange and 2 more knocked out as they closed range, but observing the remaining 5 T-34s reach point-blank range where they destroyed all 3 Tigers through combined fire from multiple directions, outcome that validated Soviet tactical doctrine even though it cost 7 T-34s to eliminate 3 Tigers, because those 7 T-34s could be replaced within a week, while the 3 Tigers represented irreplaceable German combat power that took months to manufacture and that could not be regenerated quickly enough to affect the strategic balance. The industrial statistics that explain Soviet production superiority are staggering in their implications. At peak production in 1943, Soviet factories were manufacturing approximately 200 T-34s per month, while German factories were producing approximately 100 Tigers per month, 12-1 advantage that grew even larger when considering that T-34 production required roughly 1/3 the manufacturing time per tank compared to Tigers, meaning that the same industrial resources that Germany devoted to producing 1 Tiger could have produced 4 or 5 T-34s if Soviet design philosophy had been applied. though whether German industry could have adopted Soviet production methods without catastrophic quality failures remains questionable given the different industrial cultures and workforce skill levels. The broader strategic implication was that Germany was fighting an industrial war using artisanal production methods, treating tank manufacturing as specialized craft requiring master precision when the operational requirement was producing adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities. Philosophical mistake that reflected German cultural attitudes about engineering excellence, but that proved catastrophically inappropriate for total war where quantity had quality all its own. The Tiger's technical specifications, which seemed so impressive on paper, with 100mm frontal armour and 88mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at extreme range, created a false sense of security among German commanders who believed that technical superiority would compensate for numerical inferiority, assumption that was validated in individual engagements where properly employed Tigers achieved extraordinary kill ratios, but that failed strategically because individual engagements were meaningless when German forces were losing the production war so badly that every Tiger destroyed represented net loss, while every Soviet tank destroyed was replaced faster than German forces could eliminate them. The specific example of the Battle of Kursk, where German forces deployed hundreds of Tigers and Panthers with the expectation that their technical superiority would allow them to break through Soviet defenses despite numerical disadvantages, illustrated this strategic fallacy at massive scale, because even though German heavy tanks achieved impressive tactical results, destroying Soviet tanks at ratios that favoured Germany, the operation ultimately failed because Soviet forces could absorb losses that would have been catastrophic for German forces and could continue fighting effectively despite losing thousands of tanks because production was replacing those losses continuously. The maintenance burden that Tigers imposed on German logistics created another dimension of their strategic liability, because each Tiger required a tail of maintenance vehicles, spare parts, recovery equipment, and specialized mechanics that multiplied the actual resource cost beyond the tank itself, while T34s could be maintained by crews with basic mechanical knowledge and could often be repaired in field conditions using improvised methods that would have been impossible with more complex vehicles, giving Soviet forces logistical advantages that complemented their numerical superiority and that allowed them to maintain operational tempo that German forces could not match. The specific example of German Tiger units spending as much time conducting maintenance as conducting combat operations, with typical operational availability rates around 60%, meaning that 40% of Tigers were non-operational at any given time, contrasted sharply with T-34 availability rates that often exceeded 90%, despite Soviet units having less sophisticated maintenance infrastructure. Paradox that demonstrated how design simplicity could be more valuable than technical sophistication when measured by operational effectiveness rather than by individual performance metrics. The crew experience comparison between T-34 and Tiger operators reveals human dimensions of the technical trade-off, because Tiger crews operated in relative comfort with sophisticated equipment that made their job easier and with the confidence that their armour would protect them from most enemy fire, while T-34 crews endured cramped conditions, difficult manual controls, poor visibility, and the knowledge that their armour provided only modest protection against German guns. Yet T-34 crews also knew that they were part of an unstoppable tide of Soviet armour that would eventually overwhelm German resistance regardless of individual tank quality, psychological advantage that helped compensate for the physical disadvantages of operating inferior equipment. The letters and memoirs from T-34 crews describe a paradoxical situation where individual fear of being killed in tanks that offered limited protection coexisted with collective confidence that Soviet tank forces would prevail through sheer numbers, duality that characterized much of Soviet military experience during World War II, where individual soldiers faced horrific dangers while simultaneously believing that collective Soviet strength would achieve victory. The optical equipment comparison between German and Soviet tanks illustrated another dimension, where German technical superiority provided real tactical advantages that Soviet numerical superiority had to overcome through different means, because Tiger tanks were equipped with sophisticated range-finding equipment and high-quality periscopes that allowed accurate fire at long range under conditions where T-34 crews were essentially shooting blind, forcing Soviet tactics to emphasize closing range to distances where optical advantages became irrelevant and where the chaotic conditions of close combat negated German precision. The specific disadvantage of T-34 crew members having extremely limited visibility from inside the tank, with the driver seeing almost nothing except what was directly ahead and with the commander having to expose himself by opening the hatch to get adequate situational awareness, meant that T-34s were vulnerable to being ambushed or flanked by German tanks that could observe and engage from positions where they were invisible to Soviet crews. Tactical vulnerability that could only be overcome by operating in large groups where some tanks would inevitably spot threats even if individual tanks had poor visibility. Another example of how Soviet doctrine adapted to equipment limitations rather than attempting to match German technical standards. The post-war assessment of the T-34 versus Tiger competition by military analysts in Western countries revealed interesting divergence between professional military opinion and popular perception, because while popular histories often portrayed the Tiger as the superior tank and the T-34's success as merely numerical victory of quantity over quality, professional military analysis recognized that the T-34's design was actually more sophisticated than it appeared in that it optimized for the most important variables, including producibility, maintainability, and operational reliability, while accepting trade-offs in areas like crew comfort and optical quality that mattered less for achieving strategic objectives. The specific insight that Soviet design philosophy was not crude, but rather represented different optimization priorities compared to German design philosophy, challenged narratives about Western technological superiority, and suggested that the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness was more complex than simple quality versus quantity dichotomies suggested, because the quantity that Soviet industry produced was not random accumulation, but rather strategic application of design principles that prioritized operational impact over engineering elegance. The Tiger's vulnerability to Soviet anti-tank guns, particularly the 85mm and 100mm weapons that were deployed in large numbers from 1943 onward, demonstrated that armor protection, no matter how impressive, could always be defeated by sufficiently powerful guns, making the Tiger's armor advantage less decisive than German planners had hoped, and creating situations where Tigers were destroyed by anti-tank guns before they could exploit their superior tank versus tank capabilities. Another example of how focusing on tank versus tank combat as the primary measure of effectiveness missed the broader reality that tanks operated in environments where multiple threats existed and where survivability depended on more than just armor thickness. The Soviet development of specialized anti-tank units equipped with guns powerful enough to defeat German heavy armor represented strategic response to German technical superiority that bypassed the challenge of matching German tank quality by instead creating asymmetric capabilities that could neutralize German advantages through different means. Approach that illustrated the broader principle that military competition is not won by matching enemy capabilities, but by exploiting their vulnerabilities through unexpected methods. The strategic consequences of the T-34 versus Tiger production imbalance extended beyond immediate battlefield outcomes to shape the entire trajectory of the Eastern Front War, because German inability to produce heavy tanks in sufficient numbers meant that Wehrmacht offensive capability was progressively degraded as losses accumulated faster than replacements could be manufactured, while Soviet ability to replace losses and continuously expand tank forces meant that Red Army offensive potential grew stronger throughout 1943 and 1944, creating a positive feedback loop where German weakness and Soviet strength reinforced each other until the strategic balance became so unfavourable that German defeat became inevitable regardless of tactical outcomes in individual battles. The specific turning point when this strategic dynamic became irreversible probably occurred sometime in late 1943 after the failure of Operation Zitadelle at Kursk, when German forces had committed their strategic reserves, including large numbers of Tigers and Panthers, and had failed to achieve breakthrough despite local tactical successes, demonstrating that even massive concentration of German heavy armour could not overcome Soviet defences when those defences were prepared in depth, and when Soviet forces had sufficient numerical superiority to absorb losses that would have shattered German formations. The technological legacy of both T-34 and Tiger extended far beyond World War II to influence post-war tank design worldwide, with the T-34's sloped armour and emphasis on mobility influencing Western designs, while the Tiger's powerful gun and heavy armour influenced Soviet post-war heavy tank development, creating a situation where both design philosophies contributed to Cold War tank doctrine, even though the T-34 was ultimately more successful during World War II. The economic cost comparison between producing T-34s and Tigers revealed the full magnitude of the strategic miscalculation that German tank procurement represented, because while exact cost figures are difficult to establish due to different accounting methods and currency issues, reasonable estimates suggest that a single Tiger cost approximately 3 to 4 times as much to produce as a T-34 when accounting for raw materials, manufacturing time, and skilled labour requirements, meaning that Germany was spending resources that could have produced 4 T-34 equivalent tanks to instead produce one Tiger that was individually superior but strategically insufficient. The broader implication was that Germany was engaging in a strategic competition where they were building Ferraris to fight an enemy deploying Fords. And while each Ferrari was faster and more sophisticated than each Ford, the competition was not a race, but a war of attrition, where having 100 Fords was strategically superior to having 25 Ferraris, regardless of individual vehicle quality. Metaphor that captures the essential strategic mismatch between German and Soviet approaches to armoured warfare. The final German production figures tell a story of strategic failure masked by tactical excellence, because the approximately 1,350 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers that Germany produced during the war represented impressive manufacturing achievements given the complexity of these vehicles, but were utterly insufficient to achieve strategic objectives when facing a Soviet Union that produced approximately 84,000 T-34s plus additional thousands of other tank types. Numerical disparities so vast that even if German heavy tanks achieved kill ratios of 20-1, which was exceptionally optimistic and rarely achieved in actual combat, German tank forces would still be eliminated through attrition, while Soviet forces retained massive reserves. The specific calculation that Germany would have needed to produce approximately 20,000 Tigers to achieve parity with Soviet tank forces based on relative combat effectiveness, illustrates why the Tiger program, despite its technical achievements, was strategically irrelevant, because German industry could not possibly manufacture vehicles at that scale regardless of how much resources were devoted to tank production, making the entire heavy tank program a magnificent engineering dead end that consumed resources without altering strategic fundamentals. The American and British perspectives on the T-34 versus Tiger competition, documented in intelligence assessments and technical evaluations conducted during and after the war, reveal interesting patterns of both admiration and condescension, with Western observers praising the T-34's practical design and acknowledging its battlefield effectiveness while simultaneously criticizing its crude manufacture and uncomfortable crew conditions, evaluations that reflected Western industrial culture's emphasis on refinement and quality control, but that sometimes missed the strategic brilliance of Soviet willingness to accept lower individual quality in exchange for overwhelming numerical advantage. The specific American tests of captured T-34s at Aberdeen Proving Ground noted that while the tank was mechanically sound and tactically effective, its production quality was inferior to American standards, and its crew ergonomics were unacceptable, criticisms that were technically accurate but strategically irrelevant because the operational requirement was not building the most refined tank, but rather building sufficient tanks to saturate battlefields with armour that enemies could not eliminate faster than it could be replaced. The psychological impact on German soldiers of being consistently outnumbered by Soviet tanks, despite German technical superiority, created cumulative demoralization that degraded combat effectiveness beyond what casualty figures alone would suggest, because soldiers who knew that destroying 10 enemy tanks would only result in 20 more appearing the next day began to question whether their sacrifices served any purpose and whether German victory was even possible when the enemy could afford to lose tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. The diary entries and letters from German soldiers during 1943 and 1944 document this progressive psychological collapse, with early expressions of confidence in German weapons giving way to fatalistic acceptance that numerical superiority would eventually overwhelm technical quality, and finally to open questioning of whether the war could be won or whether continued resistance merely prolonged the inevitable. Doubts that contributed to the erosion of German fighting spirit during the war's final years, when even elite units that had fought effectively throughout the war began to lose cohesion and will to resist. The Soviet industrial achievement of producing 84,000 T-34s during the war, while simultaneously evacuating factories from Western Russia to the Urals in 1941, and while maintaining production of other weapons systems, and while supporting a military force of over 11 million soldiers, represents one of the most remarkable examples of total industrial mobilization in history, demonstrating that the Soviet system, despite its numerous inefficiencies and brutalities, was capable of extraordinary achievements when focused on clear objectives and when willing to accept any sacrifice in pursuit of those objectives. The specific organizational innovations that enabled this production included radical simplification of bureaucratic approval processes to allow factory managers to make immediate decisions about production methods, acceptance of quality variation that Western factories would have rejected, use of female and juvenile labour to replace men drafted into military service, and relocation of entire factory complexes, including machinery and workers across thousands of kilometres to prevent their capture by German forces. Adaptations that demonstrated flexibility and pragmatism that contradicted stereotypes about Soviet rigidity, and that suggests that crisis conditions can sometimes enable organisational innovation that peacetime bureaucracies would prevent. The contemporary relevance of the T-34 versus Tiger comparison for modern military procurement debates centres on recurring tensions between advocates for technical superiority and advocates for numerical adequacy, because modern militaries continue to face similar trade-offs between building smaller numbers of extremely capable weapons systems versus building larger numbers of adequate systems. And the lessons from World War II suggest that the optimal strategy depends on the strategic context and the likely nature of future conflicts rather than on any universal principle about quality versus quantity. The specific example of American debates about whether to procure smaller numbers of expensive F-22 stealth fighters or larger numbers of less capable but more affordable F-35s echoes the Tiger versus T-34 debate in recognizing that individual platform capability must be balanced against total force size and against sustainability considerations including maintenance, training, and replacement costs. Though the strategic context of potential American conflicts differs so dramatically from Eastern Front conditions that direct analogies should be drawn cautiously. The final assessment of why the T-34 was strategically more successful than the Tiger, despite being individually inferior in most performance categories, must emphasize that strategy is fundamentally about aligning ends, ways, and means, and that German tank procurement failed strategically not because Tigers were poorly designed, but because they represented misalignment between operational requirements and industrial capabilities, because Germany needed weapons that could be produced in sufficient quantities to sustain multi-year war of attrition, while German industry produced weapons optimized for short, intense conflicts where technical superiority would be decisive. Strategic mismatch that reflected broader German failure to understand that World War II would be won through industrial mobilization and attrition rather than through operational brilliance and technological superiority. The Soviet success with T-34 production, conversely, reflected alignment between strategic requirements and industrial capabilities, with a tank design that was deliberately optimized for mass production and that accepted individual performance limitations in exchange for numerical superiority that could overwhelm enemy forces regardless of their technical capabilities. Coherence between strategy and implementation that helps explain Soviet victory on the Eastern Front despite catastrophic losses and despite numerous tactical and operational failures that would have destroyed forces relying on smaller numbers of more capable weapons. The human cost of the T-34 versus Tiger competition should not be forgotten in analyses focused on technical specifications and production statistics, because the exchange ratios that justified Soviet mass assault tactics involved actual human beings dying in burning tanks. And while these losses may have been strategically necessary, and while they contributed to defeating fascist aggression, they represented individual tragedies for the tank crews who died and for their families who lost them. Reminder that wars are ultimately about human suffering, regardless of how they are analysed through strategic and technical frameworks. The memoirs from both Soviet and German tank crews document the terror and trauma of armoured combat where death came suddenly and violently, and where survival often depended more on luck than on skill or equipment quality. Experiences that should temper any celebration of either German technical achievements or Soviet production accomplishments with recognition that these achievements were purchased through human suffering on a scale that should never be forgotten or minimized in pursuit of analytical clarity.